Let's talk about what other kinds of logging and tracing affordances folks should know.
So another pretty useful one is the execution log. And this is essentially a record of all of the spawns, so the external processes that executed inside the build. And for the purpose of this discussion, although they're not exactly the same thing, you can assume that a spawn is just a build action. Most actions are spawns. Not every action is a spawn. That's the more complicated picture. But essentially, every time Bazel needs to run a binary with some command line arguments and inputs to produce an output, or needs to first look up for a previous execution of that binary in the disk cache or a remote cache, the fact that that lookup was done, and maybe the lookup was a cache miss and you had to run the binary, that's going to be recorded in the execution log. And this is sort of a more detailed view of what's going on inside an action than the trace profile, because the trace profile, for example, will not give you any information about the specific files that are inputs to the action or what the command line arguments look like. And the primary use case for the execution log is to debug non-determinism issues. So if you have a build action that runs in two different occasions and it has exactly the same inputs, you would expect the second run to get a cache hit, but for some reason it doesn't. That implies there is some sort, that might imply there is some sort of non-determinism issue at play. And you can use the execution log to figure out exactly what was different between the two different executions of the action to figure out where the problem might have come from.
Right. So for those watching the video here, we're looking at the, again, on the Bazel website. If you search for troubleshooting cache hits, you'll find this section that describes using execution logs to determine what's different. So in order to, so I guess there's a few steps involved here that we should describe. So the first step is, how do I gather this execution log? Should I turn it on for all of my builds so that every time CI runs, I have an execution log available to compare with the previous run?
So historically, we had an execution log. So first of all, this is a non-demand feature. So you actually have to set a flag before your build in order to get information. If the build is done and you didn't set the flag, then that information is unfortunately lost forever. So it is the sort of thing that you need to remember to capture before it's too late. Historically, the format produced by the execution log was too expensive, both in the sense that it incurred in a performance hit, so your build could become noticeably slower because of the overhead of producing the log, and also the files, the produced files were unreasonably large. I'm going to talk mostly about the worst case here. It wasn't this bad for everyone, but we had reports of people whose builds were taking 3 times as longer and produced output files whose size was in the order of tens or hundreds of gigabytes for the execution log, which is definitely detracts from the usefulness of this feature, because now you have to choose between having build performance and being able to investigate what went wrong with your build.
Yes. So the next part of the story, of course, is that you have fixed this for us in Bazel 7.1, and hopefully a lot of the audience has already been able to upgrade to Bazel 7.1. So what's the new answer for this question?
Right. So the new answer is we had to radically redesign this format. And the problem, I'm of course not going to go into a lot of details here, but the problem is that we had a lot of redundant information in the old format, and the way to fix the problem is to get rid of the redundancy, to have some sort of back references in the format, so that we don't have to keep repeating ourselves. And then there was also some more technical issues around being able to produce it fast enough so that it does not unduly impact build performance. So the new format, which I called it the compact format, because the killer feature here really is that it's up to 1,000 times smaller than the old format, is actually small enough and cheap enough to produce that you can potentially keep these on all the time so that every time you have a performance issue, you can go back to the build where that happened and inspect the log and figure out where it came from.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know I'm a very enthusiastic user of this feature too. Now that I have, so maybe on CI, I set this flag for the execution log. There's a new flag I need to turn on to get the compact execution log, right?
Right. So essentially, we have a different flag for each format. They're mutually exclusive. You can produce one or the other, but that's how you opt into a specific format of the execution log. Now, the way you go about using doing something with this log, of course, one of the problems is that this is not exactly a human readable format, both because we had to make sure that it's not too large, which necessarily implies some form of compression. This is both at the level of the data structure we're serializing into the file, and then we also actually apply zstd on top of these things so we can compress it down further. So it's not something you can, say, open with a text editor and easily inspect. And so we ship a couple of tools in the Bazel repo that you can use to inspect this log. And the way this works right now is you have to first convert the new compact format into the old format, and then use a tool that receives the old format as the input to actually do, for example, a diff between two different executions to figure out exactly what didn't match between the two. And this is sort of a temporary set of affairs. I would love to have a tool here that doesn't actually require you to go through the conversion step first, but it's a starting point that allowed us to leverage tooling that already existed before the new format was designed and implemented.
Right. Yeah, and I know another thing that's difficult about that tooling today is that the first step, as we're showing here, is you have to clone the Bazel repo and build some Java programs inside in order to do this. So of course, it would be nice, if somebody will make an easier way to access this tooling and not, a little bit more like the Perfetto tool where I can just go to a web page and load up my file and then I can see what I need to see.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be lovely to see. I think that would make this much easier to use and give more opportunities for actually following up on these sorts of problems, which can sometimes be very tricky to notice.